we'll set it all up perfectly so
Let me just check again here and see how many pages it is. Should be 7 or 6. I can't remember. 1, 2, 3.
End of the paragraph. Another day.
Okay. I have it marked.
Okay. Whenever you're ready, start.
All right. I was for many years an ardent reader of H.P. Lovecraft's fantastic stories. A great friend of mine, Joe, had a similar liking, and when he used to visit at our home, he and I often discussed the stories. One week in 1976, my friend made a long weekend visit to our home, and he and I hatched a plan to take a sentimental journey dedicated to Lovecraft and his old stomping grounds in Vermont. The first day, for warm-up, we visited everything near Cambridge, New York, that had the same Lovecraftian flavor as the stories we enjoyed so much. We went up into the back hills to visit the Funny Stone, which was a stone that had a bowl-like top that held rainwater. Then we visited a curious large ring of stones, also in the backwoods. Then a cave along an Indian trail high up in the local hills. After that, we rode to the Hoosick Indian Mound and walked over to it and across it. Later, we rode to the St. Croix Terrace, near Hoosick Falls. We drove past the little house near Tribes Hill, where objects were said to fly across the room on a regular basis. The following day, we planned to take a day trip to Brattleboro, Vermont and surrounding townships. The next day, we started early and headed to Brattleboro. First off, when we reached it, we stopped at my friend Reverend Nelson Egbert's house to see if he would like to come along. Unfortunately, he was visiting parishioners. We went on down by the site of Stephen Day Press, where Lovecraft's friend, Rest Orton, had done much creative work. Along the main street, as we were soaking up the distinct vibrations of this New England mountain village, I noticed a sight much in keeping with the uniqueness of our venture. A very ornate old church, which had been turned into a combination Oriental rug and bookstore, displayed on table-like shelves with books all down the sides. And I, of course, went straight to the books. And they were a very diverse mixture, I must say. Finding a black cloth-backed volume caught my eye. I picked it up. The Mothman Prophecies was the title. I wasn't sure if it was simply another work of fiction, but as I opened it and studied a few pages, I realized it was more nonfiction by an author named John A. Keel. The clincher was when I saw some lines where Keel remarked that his life was becoming like something out of an H.P. Lovecraft story. That was the clincher. I took the book and bought it, feeling like it might be snatched at any moment away from me if I didn't hurry and do this. Joe and I continued our journey by riding to Newfane to focus on Dark Mountain, the area described in such detail of the fantastic sort by Lovecraft in his long story, The Whisperer in Darkness. Here we located the mountainous area suggestive of Lovecraft's story and drove slowly to more completely absorb the vibrations of such a darkly beautiful panorama. At one point I stopped, resembling etched stone, the words Yugoth. Someone else with a similar admiration for Lovecraft had made the journey and left that memorial offering to the author's Plutonian concept. These, we realized, were the same mountain woods Lovecraft described in reference to the great floods of the 1920s in which strange carcasses of drowned creatures were seen floating down the mountain torrents. The bloated remnants seen and then looked at by the frightened locals who would change the subject and then try hard to sleep at night. At least the story conjured such visions of that fictional time and reality. I patted a copy of the book brought along containing the original story, one of Auguste Derleth's simple but beautiful editions from Arkham House. I felt almost like it was a way of having the book signed, to hold it in the presence of the landscape that helped to inspire its creation. From there we continued on to Weston, Vermont. Another hour's drive, but a brave chance at the thought of seeing Vrest Orton, Lovecraft's actual friend, at his old Vermont country store. Unfortunately, we arrived just as he was leaving on some errands, but were at least able to meet him and mark ourselves as admirers of Lovecraft.
Yes, he said. Great memories. He was like a time traveler from another age.
With that graphic image of his author friend etched in our minds, we parted company with this amazing spirit who went on to finish his errands. It was late, and as we drove down towards Cambridge, we talked excitedly about the places we had been and the thoughts kindled by the journey. When we got back to Cambridge, we talked on into the night, mostly the sort of talk those who enjoy reading have following the release of a new title by an admired author. Only this time it felt like we were in the book. Joe left the next morning, and I figured to use my spare time reading the newly acquired Mothman prophecies. John A. Keel was a brand new writer to me, but I soon came to know him through this remarkable book. The Mothman Prophecies is a bold book. It has the uncanny quality about it Lovecraft stories have themselves. He describes his experiences with the confidence of a person describing any common series of events. Only these experiences are very far from common. Looking back now on this week in 1976, when I first read the prophecies, I realized that the persona used by Keel in portraying himself is not unlike the character portrayed by Bill Paxton in Twister years later. The man champing at the bit to be off on a new death-defying fabulous adventure. Only in Keel's case, the adventure is real, and the events go way beyond the drama of nature, however spectacular that drama may be. I read aloud to my wife Nancy from the amazing book. From the get-go, I was spellbound at Keel's taking for granted that we would accept his accounts of weird, semi-people living among us, using cryptic language, sometimes wearing dark suits, which concept was to become very famous in years to come as Men in Black. Keel's Men in Black, however, were likely to appear as if from a time warp in a totally mint-condition car from another age, a car which even smelled new. Keel's approximate title in this milieu was that of ufologist, a person who studies UFOs, their appearances, and their history. Keel's study, however, was way outside the usual run-of-the-mill study of that phenomenon. It introduced characters like Mr. Cold, who appeared from a strange sort of craft, introduced himself, and then took off to return another day. I was riveted to the book. It was so totally offbeat and colloquial in its description. Keel introduced concepts of beings who appeared and were widely observed. He was particularly interested in the one dubbed Mothman, which was closely allied to Bigfoot-type monsters. Around 7 or 8 feet tall, it had huge wings, very large eyes which glowed red, and he made a loud, shrill screaming sound, and was said to leave a sulphurous or rotten egg smell in the air where he had appeared. Keel also took a particular interest in the history and archaeology in the areas where these monsters and the UFOs appeared, laying particular stress on American Indian legends covering hundreds of years. In this, he showed a further kinship with Lovecraft, who worked much legend and myth into his fantastic fiction. By the end of a week of nightly readings, Nancy and I were heavily steeped in Keel and his amazing take on things. He had studied so closely in his adventurous life. Then it began. We were sitting in the dining room one afternoon, and as I was reading to myself, my wife said,
"Now look what you've done."
I looked up. The news was covering local interest fees.
They've been hearing strange screams and howls from the forest at night, and the legend runs deep in this culture.
My wife also experienced the surprise of a lifetime last night when they looked into a cornfield and saw a gigantic animal standing upright. Witnesses described the creature to look like a large man with a dark animalistic exterior and glowing red eyes.
Because when you look at the reports, there are eyewitnesses, there's all sorts of evidence to indicate that there is a possibility.
They called in a local law enforcement officer who also saw the animal but was not able to get close enough to it to photograph it. He described it the same way as the hikers, but added that it gave a loud, shrill, screaming sound as it moved across the field. I sat totally speechless. At first I smiled at what my wife had said, but it was a smile of one in light shock. "I'm going to get a newspaper," I said. I walked next door to the sandwich shop store and bought a copy of the Hoosick Falls Standard Press. Walking back with it and sitting down at the table, I opened it and read the heading, "Officers Track Creature." The story repeated the account we had heard on the news. The main officer witness was named Brian Goslin. The area where the sighting had taken place was off of Abear Road outside Whitehall.
They called the state police up for us, and they came out, state police came out with us, the sheriffs, everybody else, a lot of people out there. There was 11 of us all together. So we were out in the field, and I thought it took a long out. We heard a screaming noise.
I called Joe up and told him the story. He was impressed and excited at the synchronistic timing of the events, almost as if we had created our own Stonehenge by our doings of the week before and somehow passed beyond the stones into another reality. And here it was. The next couple of days I did a lot of thinking. Nancy and I had become nearly worn out talking about the book we had read together and comparing the creature descriptions to the ones Keel had described. We were fortunate to have a neighbor who was open-minded enough so ideas could be run past him. Armed with a copy of the Standard Press, I visited with him on his front porch one day. Eventually, I felt comfortable enough to walk back and bring the Mothman book over to show him. He was totally fascinated and got into the mystery of it almost immediately. When you feel like you're bordering on the outskirts of reality, it's nice to have friends to help keep some perspective. A couple more days passed. The curious mixture of ideas and realities was finally starting to settle when one evening there came a knock at the door. It was my neighbor, Mark. He was excited and agitated.
"If you hurry, I'm driving down to the Central School. Our friends down there said there's a weird light in the sky above the playing field, and they want us to see it."
I yelled to Nancy that I had to go with Mark for a minute, and grabbing my windbreaker, I ran to the driveway and got into the car with Mark and his kids, and we drove off down the street. When we reached the school, there was a local policeman and a crowd of neighbors gathered. We could already see what they were looking at. High above the field were 3 bright lights. They appeared to be 3 separate craft of some sort rather than the 3 lights on a plane or helicopter. They were moving in unison, however. They moved in strange zigzag patterns. We watched perhaps for 10 or so minutes, And then amazingly, they took off like a shot and disappeared over the trees. One of the neighbors had taken some snapshots of the lights, fortunately. We all milled around for a few minutes and then loaded back into Mark's car and drove back to our houses. I told Mark more of what I had read in Keel's book. I felt excited but almost embarrassed to be enmeshed in these events which so closely resembled the events described in the Mothman accounts. How could this be, I thought? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it as my wife had said, actually? Now look what you've done. Was it a kind of warning or preparation? Whatever it was, the timing was uncanny. The next day I bought a copy of the local paper, and the headline this time read, UFOs are being sighted all over Cambridge. There was a picture showing the same lights that we had been watching the day before. I clipped the story and put it in the front of the Keel book along with the Officer Track Creature one. I continued reviewing Keel's book, now more intensely, about the smaller details he described. Another day passed. Mark knocked on my door again. He had begun to follow the news much more carefully since the combination of our talks and the events at the school field.
We have friends in Whitehall who called us,
he said excitedly. Mark had been talking to his friends the last couple of days, and events of the odd had continued there, following the creature sighting.
There have been lots of new things going on. One woman actually had one of those metal things land in her yard, and other people saw it. A small one, apparently. And get this, even one of those flying things you read me about was seen. It was huge. But they thought it was a huge bird, like what the Indians called a thunderbird.
Mark told me he had ordered a copy of the Keel book at the Bennington bookshop in nearby Bennington, Vermont. Our lives had all been touched in the last few days' time. That was for certain. But how, why, and by what? A lot to think about.